But did you follow up? The Palo Alto suicide clusters and media accountability piece aims to explore media accountability regarding the coverage of the Palo Alto suicide clusters and emphasize the numerous and complex factors that can lead to a person dying by suicide.
In my case, for example, I was not thinking about death. I was just thinking about a way to pause.
6 Palo Alto students died by suicide between 2009 and 2011 before another 4 students took their own lives in 2015. Santa Clara County Public Health Department reached out to the Center for Disease Control in early 2016 to investigate the 2 suicide clusters to learn what factors may play a role in suicide among youth and propose ways to help suicide prevention. Work is being done to provide youth with treatment programs. Some forms of prevention suggested by the study include cognitive behavior therapy and early detection of youth with symptoms of severe mental illness. It also suggests being mindful of parenting, child relationships, substance abuse problems, exposure to violence, as well as using suicide prevention hotlines and resources. There's been concern over how the media coverage has affected the Palo Alto community as it works to implement these prevention and treatment measures, with a few residents sharing the media only presented a small and limited piece of a very complex puzzle.
When a national media outlet comes in, tries to make a quick and dirty story but not really be part of the solution, and then go publish it to the world in order to sell more TV ads, that hurts. It feels like we're being used, but they're not actually sticking around to try to get to the root of the problem and help create solutions and help create dialogue.
We had 6 teenage suicides in 2009, 2011. People tend to forget about the one that happened in 2011. No journalist came to this town to write a long-form piece about that. It took the suicide clusters to start up again, and then we had to have 3 kids kill themselves. And then a journalist comes to town.
There's just really terrible media practices that are being done, like showing the train flying past the school over and over and over again. And that kind of imagery and the kind of language that uses the specific means by which someone dies by suicide can be triggers for people.
And most journalists, unless they have specialized in education, don't really understand how a school day functions and what's going on in those classrooms. 1, 2 visits, 4 over the course of some weeks or months. Talks to a lot of people, leaves town, writes the article, does interviews on the radio, and moves on to a bunch of other stories, which they obviously have to do. That's their profession. It's not necessarily conducive to gaining a real in-depth understanding of what's going on in that situation.
One of the aims of that dialogue is to challenge perspectives on suicide, specifically that suicide ideation, much less dying by suicide, is an incredibly selfish act.
A lot of the stigma around suicide is the idea that attempting suicide or committing suicide is selfish. And I think people have to understand that someone who is having suicide ideation or who is suffering from depression is not having rational thought. That person is not necessarily wanting to die.
Half of people go through some sort of emotional crisis in their lifetime. If they don't have a mental disorder, it doesn't mean that's all the people who have therapy in their lifetime. So it's like we need to destigmatize it and make it more like the way I talk to people about therapy. It's a way of improving your coping and adaptation.
Most of us in our emotional lives, it's kind of a mess in there. We're trying to figure it out all the time. To expect that a teenager in the midst of adolescence would be able to identify something tangible that, if fixed, relate to that to me is like preposterous.
Physical ailments can sometimes be a lot easier to deal with than mental and emotional, because it's always there. It's just, you're battling yourself.
Comments about, Palo Alto students just being rich and bored, that's just not the case. There's just such a diversity of personal experience among the students who have died by suicide, there's no way to summarize them as all being rich and bored. And obviously nobody dies because they're bored. That's just not how it works.
I think it's really unfair of people to say that, like, oh, just because you're like wealthier maybe, or you have better education, that like you won't have these sort of problems. You know, like different problem sets come with different sorts of like social classes or different like economic statuses. And I think that people definitely in Pali or in Gun or like in the whole community, they may be better off, but that doesn't mean that they don't suffer from the same problems that everyone else does.
A start could be modifying the way the media chooses to present the matter to the public.
So I think the kind of media coverage that I don't take issue with is the kind of like really thoughtful journalism that's asking questions of a wide variety of people and getting opinions from everyone, from current students to senior citizens in the community about what they think are factors, and really trying to provide a more nuanced, complex and complicated perspective, and try not to summarize each person as sort of just this faceless cog in a wheel of people who are dying, and acting like it's some unknown, unrecognizable force that's just sort of moving through Palo Alto that's like unstoppable, because I think that just sort of generates fear and creates this sort of sense of chaos and inability to control the situation, which is obviously good for news ratings, but not good for the community.